So welcome everyone to Orlando Python for September on Hurricane Ian Eve. I'm glad we had a bunch of people coming out knowing that everyone is in their own stage of preparation for that. For this month, we're going to take a look at Poetry, which is a project management command line tool for Python, and it's equivalent in nature to NPM, Node Package Manager, in the Node JavaScript world. It has some. It attempts to solve some things that have been attempted and had some amount of success in the past, like pipenv, pipex as well to a degree, but actually plays well with pipex, and we can see that in a quick second here. In addition to providing a unified place for your project management, it is also going to be your virtual environment manager. It's going to make sure there are ways to use it to automatically keep all of your dependencies up to date. So some really good things from where we would have used a lot of different programs in the past. Poetry has taken it and tried to condense it all down without removing access and trying to try to be a one-stop shop. And we'll see what that means in a little bit. So just jumping right in, I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we'll just start to quickly take a look at some of the docs. This is a very quick preview. We're on the GitHub page here. It is open source, as with everything Python. Oh, and I should say Poetry also requires Python 3.7 or later. If you are using something before that, you are missing out on a lot of good stuff. And do upgrade. Here we go. Now it's redoing it here. So what you're seeing in this little animatic here is not if you're starting a new project, but if you downloaded a project, that Poetry install, very similar to NPM install, where I've downloaded a project, it has well, in this case, a poetry.lock file, and now you have the exact same environment because we've pinned all the dependencies, that sort of thing. A really good thing that Poetry does is it builds off of this standard, relatively new standard for Python called a pyproject.toml file. And that's just, we're going to have all of our configuration in there. So you can see here's our high level information, things like we would need to have in PyPI. Our dependencies list, including Python itself, because every library needs to have a minimum, or should specify a minimum Python version. And there's some really cool things that we can look at, like the extras here. Those are those little extra bits where you can install a library, but if there are optional features that you want that go above and beyond, maybe it's for a library that most people don't need, that's really expensive to install. Those are the kind of things you can put in here. Allow for pre-releases, getting things directly from Git, and you can even specifically set a particular branch. There's all sorts of good things. Docs as well. It can also help manage your documentation. And standard scripts for making command line tools. So all of this, maybe except for the docs, is something that you would get in the old school setup.py built-in package dependency libraries, like setup tools is what it really used to be. And the community as a whole is moving to this pyproject.toml specification. And the really cool thing is in addition to just the things that Poetry supports out of the box with this pyproject.toml, you can add your testing config, your black config, pylint configs, all the different configs for your development dependencies can be in just a single location. So with that primer on there, you can jump into the documentation here and see how to install it. Now, similar to other languages, it's really just assuming that you have Python installed on your machine, and it's the appropriate version. And while you can install it with pip, it's not really meant to be installed like a regular library. It really is more meant to be, you can see here, Linux, well, all of these different ones, you can do a curl command to install it, and then it installs itself on the system level because it is a virtual env manager in and of itself. Other things like pipex, I mentioned pipex before. Pipex is specifically an environment manager for command level or command line tools, because pipex is itself also an environment manager. So either of these ways is going to be the preferred way to remove, to install Poetry, but to allow itself to auto update outside the scope of something like Anaconda. Just as an example. Coincidentally, I mentioned Anaconda because I currently have it installed as part of Anaconda, because that's what I use for my Python language management tool. But this is similar to how you might update npm as just a node package. If you've used npm and it gets out of date, it will just pop, hey, just copy paste this command, and you'll just update npm. Similar to how in the Python world with pip, we'll get a note from pip saying, I'm out of date, go ahead and run this to update pip, and pip updates itself. Poetry will do the same thing. It's trying to be the same thing. All right, install. Don't really need to show installing or anything, but just wanted to point out that it is meant to be outside of a project scope. It is a command line utility. So now, assuming that Poetry is on your machine, we can get into the basic usage. And the first thing that we can do is we can create a new project. I am going to open a VS Code window here so we can show that. And switch over to, well, I'll go full screen here. I think that should make things a little easier. There we go. And get things moved over to the side there. All right, now we have our editor here. You can see I have my base environment from Anaconda there, but we have Poetry already installed and all of the different commands that it supports. I'm not going to go through all of these, of course, but we're going to go through new, install, the dependency management, run is a really big one, things of that nature. So the first thing we can do is we can do Poetry new, and we're just going to call it mylib because we're really original. And with that, in our environment here, we have a new folder called mylib with the following structure. Creates a new package with an init there. That's all we need for it to be a package with the version already set. And has already created our the start of a test suite for us. We have our pyproject.toml file, and this authors is already auto-filled because the first time that you set up poetry, it asks you for this information, it saves it, and so it doesn't need to keep asking you every time that you create a new project. I believe the Python version is, I'm actually not sure what sets the minimum Python version. I believe there's a default in there somewhere. I can tell you this saying that 3.9 or up is not just whatever Python version is currently in the environment. I don't think, because this environment is running Python 3.10. And then you can see we have one dev dependency already, PyTest, and that's really it. Now, if we want to do more here, and you can see that they have, it has changed it a little bit since they've made this documentation. Like, I don't believe, well, packages is only if you're going to be pushing something to PyPI. You're not, most projects that we work on is not going to be pushed up to PyPI. Initializing a pre-existing project, all of these. Oh, and then it also creates a blank README file in restructured text, which of course you can change to Markdown if you want. I certainly do. Now, let's say that we go ahead and start working. I can just be in here because I am a lazy developer. And we got foo, and let's just say it returns a Boolean, and I'm just going to, hey, look, we need to have, we're going to make a web call, httpx.get, and I think, oh, was it like paste bin or something, or like test.io? Just trying to think of the general site. Oops, let's go back over here. Is it test.io? I think was, no. Lorem ipsum.io. Let's see if we can just get that. Plugins, generators. Honestly, let's just have it pull this entire web page because we can. And we're going to say we want the response here, and we're just going to return, say rest dot. Well, let's just return true for now because I am also a lazy developer once again, and I like having my autocomplete. We don't have HTTPX in here yet. Import, HTTPX. Yay, it's there, but we don't know what that is. Or poetry doesn't know what that is. So we can do poetry, add our dependency here. Oh, that's it. We need to go into mylib. Then we can run this. So now we're in mylib. We're just like npm, whenever you run an npm command, you need to be in the root directory with your package.json. Poetry, you need to be in the same directory as your pyproject.toml. So now we can do poetry.add. It is currently updating the dependencies and installing them into our virtual environment here. You can also see that it took the current version and put HTTPX in our dependency list. And we can do that with dev dependencies, with, I think even just prod dependencies. They're going to go into virtual environment there. On the bottom here, I can make this text a little bigger for everyone. Since have a crazy screen size here. So we can look at poetry, add, and look at the help here. So add as a development dependency, add as an extra, optional dependencies, specifically specifying version of Python. So you can specify dependencies based on the Python version that they are currently running. Platform, all these good options that we haven't really gotten with previous project management tools so far. The other thing you'll notice, now that we have installed, we've created an environment, we now have this poetry.lock file. And this is going to have everything necessary to recreate this environment on another machine. This is very important when you get to large teams for QA, for your testing machines, everything that we have in here, deployment dependencies, dev dependencies, everything is going to have specifically, here's all the libraries, here's the version, here's where you can get it. Even here, well, you can see down here, here's the hash for each of the individual wheels that get downloaded. So we could, now that we have this lock file, we could blow away our entire poetry environment, and all we need to get it back is poetry install, and then it just updates the VM with all of the information that's in this lock file. This isn't necessarily news or something unfamiliar to people coming in from other languages, but this is a little newer to the Python space just because Python has been a scripting language, and it's untyped, and it's a lot loosey-goosey in a lot of ways. Not that there is anything wrong with that. It's certainly a good way to prototype, to learn, but if you need it, the tools like this now exist in a very well supported way. Looking at the chat now, so we have a question that Dunder version that's in this init here. This is a standard convention in Python to embed the actual version of a library, of a runtime, of your application in a way that is discoverable by other code. There's nothing enforcing this. Everything in Python is by convention. You can subvert it at your own peril. No one's going to stop you. There's not any checks to say, oh, you're not allowed to do this. But that's all this is. A lot of libraries do it, but again, you don't have to. And when poetry is managing your project, it will update the version number in the TOML file and in this root location. Under set interpreter here. No, I don't. Not discoverable. That I'm sure there is maybe a plugin for that, but I have not actually been using it for that just yet. You can see I have it's mostly Anaconda in here, and there's a pre-commit env in there. Oh, come on, yeah, there. All right, cool. So we have we've created a project, creates a template for us. Oh, okay. We'll follow up on that in chat, covering the difference between the poetry.lock and the pyproject.toml. There is one very, very important difference from a developer's perspective between the pyproject.toml and the poetry.lock. This lock file is not intended to be user editable. Really do think of it like it has a lock on it. This was generated from the .toml file. The things that you are meant to edit as a user are, hey, I have these dev dependencies. This is my version number. Like, let's say if I change this version number to 0.22 and I rerun, I don't know, there's poetry was it poetry update maybe? So, okay, so you can see it downgraded HTTPX from 0.23 to 0.22. And if we go into our poetry lock, I'm just going to look up HTTPX in here, and you can see there's a package. Its name is HTTPX, and the version number is 0.22. And if we want to set this back here and run update again, go back in here, our poetry lock, and you can see HTTPX has been updated back to 0.23. If you do this here, like if you tried making changes in the lock file directly, well, first off, the lock file is not really the core place to do that in the first place. It really is in here because this is your project config that you as a developer use. This poetry.lock is, okay, the developer has said they need these things. As the computer, I need this information to make sure that I can 100% recreate your environment for you. So that's good. If nothing else, down here, that's going to change, you know, the version numbers here and the hash that it uses to validate that nothing happened in transit. All of this, you know, all of this information, and this back and forth between the project management file and the lock file is going to be true in other languages as well. We have another comment. Will poetry upgrade Python itself due to the required version? If your user is on 3.9 and you specify 3.10, will it fail or install? Poetry is not a Python language version manager. The purpose of having the Python version as a dependency is, this is saying this project or this package has been written in such a way that it uses features that were introduced in this version of Python. And in order to run this package, you must have a version of Python that meets this minimum specification. Poetry is not going to do that for you. And it's not going to, poetry is not going to enforce it on a client machine. What's going to happen is Python, when it goes to, well, I guess maybe poetry, but really Python or pip or whatever, any of these other dependency tree managers, they're going to see that, oh, this person has specified a minimum Python version of 3.9, and we're currently running 3.8. I'm going to give you an install error, and you're not going to be able to run the code, because assuming you could bypass that, I believe. But the developer is essentially saying there are features in here that are going to break your environment at runtime, if not import time. So that's that. There are other things like Anaconda that you can use to manage your Python versions. I don't believe Poetry is going to do that for you, and certainly not enforce it on the client side to automatically upgrade them. It would be nice though. All right, moving on. We talked about Poetry is a virtual environment manager, and the one thing I'll say about that is, if you want to run your project from the command line, the way to do that is you have a Poetry shell here, and we are now effectively inside of this environment. The command line is now inside of this environment that is managed by Poetry, that is guaranteed to have all of the packages as specified in the lock file. So from here, you could then go and you could run Python, honestly, whatever you want. You've entered the environment. I believe, I don't think I've actually ever tried to exit it. To be honest with you, I've always just closed that current window. So that's all I'm going to do there. I'm sure it's in the list the list of commands. But that's just how you get in there. Yeah, moving on. The cool thing here that really starts getting this into NPM territory that you'll use on a regular basis is running scripts. And it's the exact same kind of syntax as Poetry run and then something else. So this comes with PyTest, so we can run Poetry run PyTest. I need to go back into the, mylib, and then we can run this again. So Poetry, inside of the environment that it manages, ran PyTest on our empty test suite that we have here. But there was one test in there and it passed. Great. Okay. Well, why can't I just, why wouldn't I just do PyTest from here? Well, you can see we're not in the virtual environment that is managed by Poetry, but maybe you have everything outside that you would need. Maybe you're not doing any pip installs. Why would you still want to do Poetry run PyTest? Well, the cool thing is we can place all of our configuration for PyTest inside of our pyproject.toml file. And I'm not sure where they have that in here just yet. Let's see. We got plugins down there, maybe libraries. There's lock file packaging, or we can just look it up using that Google foo. PyTest documentation, Poetry. We'll just look. Let's see, configuration documentation. Let's pull up an issue here. Okay, there we go. That's what I was looking for there. So inside of here, tool dot, and then the name of the tool that we are using. And that is it. Now we can just go into, PyTest configs, and whatever is in here. So we have minimum version of Poetry, test paths. Is not, in my opinion, not exactly the most useful things. to have in there. Where, oh, these are configuration formats. Dun, 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 dun. I'm actually going to just kind of jump over to an existing project so I can just copy over something that at least I personally find useful. Dun, 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 dun. Oh, I actually, oh wait, any options, that's what it was. Well, this actually might be really interesting. So I'm going to just copy over this wholesale. And what this is actually going to do is this is how you would integrate code coverage into your test suite here. And I just want to double check our code coverage, PyTest Cove, that's what it is, dev dependencies. And just put this in here. And since I added a thing, just going to do poetry update. It sees that there was a new thing to add to the lock file, PyTest coverage, and now we can do poetry run PyTest. And when I run this, because we're in poetry, it is going to use the virtual environment, and it's going to see that there is a configuration here for PyTest. And then part of PyTest is these initialization options that's going to feed this string as is effectively behind PyTest as our command line options. And that is going to enable code coverage runs for us as well. Go ahead and run this. Well, you know what? I'm not exactly sure why that didn't do it. Maybe we just don't have any code coverage. That is what you would do. But you can see the advantage here of having all of your configuration in one spot. Another thing that we could do poetry, add as a dev dependency, the black code formatter. So that got put in there. Or maybe, oh, I know what it was. I didn't save it. That's why. So let's, yeah, let's take this. Yeah, that is on me. Not being a very good developer there. And let's just resolve that. Very good. Let's just see if that picked it up. Nope. Okay, whatever. So one thing that we can do, if I could just come over here and reference this again, I can copy over this black configuration. And this is going to specifically target these versions of Python here to pull out optimizations that would be made for these specific versions. And just like we did with PyTest, we can run black. It's going to pick up this configuration right here. Oh, run black. Was it mylib? One file reformatted. And if we had yeah, so I think all it did was just add another space right here and maybe a new line, but that's it. So just kind of showing the advantage of having all of your configuration in one spot, being able to run things through the environment manager or the virtual environment, and the test suite. Let's see. It was managing documentation. I got through really the core of what I wanted to show off, like the things that are most essential on the day-to-day usage of poetry. I'd be really interested to hear if there are any questions. You want me to show something specific, just because we don't usually go over these kinds of developer tools that often. We're usually going over libraries or language features. So this is a little bit different than what we usually do as a group, especially because this is also kind of taking over the package management specifically for dealing with things like PyPI in the Python space. Well, don't have anything there. I can show off some other interesting things kind of looked at before, like the extras, how you can manage those. There's a really cool... Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I mean, I got a question. Is it okay if I share my screen?
I need to enable that, but yes. Okay, you should be good.
Okay. So this type of stuff, like I'm in the poetry log. If I go here. This is like you said. This is for this part here. I forgot what you said it was for.
Oh yeah. So yeah, this is the thing I was just about to pull up. That's really cool. This extras that you're looking at here. So we look at Smart Open just below it. Might be a little bit easier to look at.
Yeah.
So Smart Open is a dependency, just like any of the other ones in the list, but we're doing something a little more with it. We have so Smart Open, we're still specifying a version, but now there's this extras item that's attached to it. And this is those optional command line installs that we can do. So you are in on the command line here. I'm actually, was it poetry install? I know how to do this with just a regular pip install. I'm not sure if poetry does it just a little bit differently. But the way that you would do this normally is, let's say we're doing like a pip install. So if this library is on PyPI and you want to include it in a project, oh, wait a second. I think I'm backwards here. This extras bit, I think, is actually going the other way around. So in the command line, when we pip install something, just normally, there are extras that can be attached to a project. An example for me is I have a library that does a lot of string interpolation and other things, but there's an optional feature in there that deals with coordinates on a grid, being able to find the closest things to a point. And I actually use SciPy for that. Now, SciPy is orders of magnitude a larger install than my library. And I don't want to require people that want to use my library to always install SciPy if they're not going to use this feature. So this is where this is where the extras come into play. And what you're looking at here is this library wants to install this version with the following extras. So Smart Open, you're specifically working with S3, and that also jives with the Python configuration library above it, which is installing the extras necessary to integrate or to use YAML files and to integrate with AWS. On the command line, if we were doing pip, it would look like pip install square brackets S3, and then outside the square brackets, smart open. That's how you would do it if you were just installing things normally. And that is, and then in the poetry configuration, that's how they're doing this here.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And you can do that in poetry itself as well. I'll take the screen back here.
Thank you.
And pop back onto the desktop here. In this file, or this project right here, this is what I was talking about, where I have SciPy as an optional install. And you can see in our project, or well, in this case, the library dependencies, here's my needed version of Python. So this needs greater than or equal to Python 3.8. And well, I don't know if it works on 3.12 yet. I know it works on 3.11. Requires GeoPy, HTTPX, dateutil, and XMLDict. But then these three down here, these are specified as optional dependencies. So these are RapidFuzz, SciPy, and Shapely are not going to be installed normally. In a separate section here, we have our extras, and this is where I specify the different extras like we saw in that other file, where it was, you know, this could be AWS. It could be any of the things in there. And from there, so if you were to do AVW or pip install brackets fuzz AVWX, well, now that's saying, okay, I need all of these, plus I need whatever rapid fuzz is, which is right here, this optional file. So that's how you would specify it here as extras in your project. But then, as we saw on the other screen, you can also specify your library to install extras from your dependencies. That's cool. That's exactly what I was going to pull up.
Thank you.
Got any more questions? They have a whole thing here on the pyproject.toml files, all the different configurations you can have on there. Embedding the license, always good. Authors, maintainers, specifying different README files, like you can have a docs directory. All the other kind of things that you would see pop up on PyPI can be added to the main thing. All your packages, including excluding, which is required for package management, or well, for library management to send things up to PyPI as well. Any command line scripts that you want to include. Here's the whole talk about the extras that we just saw. And of course, plugins, because there are a lot of plugins for poetry.
Michael, question. You know how you run the poetry around black?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the same thing as poetry run lint? Well, that's different.
So, well, yes. So poetry, was it poetry run? Well, Pylint it's going to be poetry run, and then whatever follows it, it would be like you running just like black and then mylib here. But when you were doing it here without going through poetry, we lose two things. We lose access to the poetry virtual environment that it runs everything in. And we also lose access to our configuration that exists in our pyproject.toml. But yeah, after that, it's whatever other tools that you have or want installed.
Because my company, they do make run black. I mean, make black. So maybe it's an alias for poetry run that they have set up, right?
Yeah. So so you would have a make file that is injecting whatever other, you know, when you get into when you get into make files, especially at a corporate level, you're doing, there's a lot of heavy lifting around each of those, at least in my experience.
Yes, I see a make file here and it has all those. Okay, I got it. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can think of it as, you know, similar, but make and make files are not specific to Python, and they are meant to do way more than poetry is. Poetry really is just trying to be NPM. You can you could, or like, it's, well, it's not trying to be NPM, but it's very similar in the usage scope and as NPM is. Makefile is really designed, you know, almost like a super powered shell scripting, rather than just a pure project management software. Let's see. As Jerry says, and I concur, make files are an ancient, useful, and poorly documented utility. Yeah. The nice thing with make files, why they are still around today, is poetry has dependency management, but it's only within Python. Make, you have dependency management at an OS level. At least my understanding of it is, make will install things that it doesn't see that are installed. Like, it's very useful, especially on Linux. But yeah, make is much more powerful, and poetry is just not trying to be make. And if you need a make file to run Black, the environment must be way more complicated than the average developer would choose to set up on their own.
Got it. Thank you.
You know, I'm sure you could do poetry run make and then whatever is after that, just to make sure that make is inside the Python environment. But I don't see a good reason to use make unless you're doing a whole lot of stitching. Just because it's possible doesn't mean you should. Any more questions? We could end early. It is hurricane season after all.
I got last one question, Mike, if you don't mind.
All right.
Have you heard of there's a file too, it says mypy.ini.
Oh, okay. So yes, MyPy. MyPy MyPy is the, let's say, the go-to or the default static type checker for Python. That is the thing that is looking at all of these type annotations and making sure that everything lines up the way that they should. It is a static type checker. It's not running at runtime. It's not meant to, but it is useful in the same way that Pylint is useful in terms of checking your code quality before making commits, or after commits, like having it automatically integrated into GitHub, which is something we can look at in the future. Now, a mypy.ini file is going to be the configuration file that is just placed inside of your project folder. However, with poetry and pyproject.toml, all the same information, you can do tool.mypy and then just put it all here. And as long as you then do poetry run mypy, it will look up your configuration inside the toml file, just like all the other utilities that we've talked about, Black, PyTest.
So isn't it better to do it this way than to have all these different, like mypy that in a different file, It's like, all right, so now that you say that, it makes sense because I do make typings in my company. So I guess it resorts to the mypy.in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
Yeah, it does depend a little bit on some of the libraries. I think there are some that just don't really like MyPy, or not MyPy, don't really like poetry just yet. But MyPy definitely does. MyPy is definitely supported by poetry in the TOML file here. And I know over in this file right here, here's my MyPy configuration right there.
Yeah. So you prefer to do it here than to have your own mypy.in file.
Yep. It since moving over to poetry here, it added a poetry lock, and it has this virtual env poetry.toml file as well, but it removed from this list the MyPy configuration, black configuration, pylint configuration, MyPy test configuration. Oh, here's why I wasn't getting the coverage thing, because I missed a thing there. It removed a number of other files, configuration files, to clean up this a little bit. I still have, there's pre-commit in here, which is its own thing. And I still have my pylint RC in here rather than being in the pyproject. But it's just the TOML file just gives you a standard place to keep track of all of these different configuration files, which is especially good if you're on a large team, because then you can just look at the commit history of just your pyproject.toml to see all the configuration changes that happened over time at a project level, as opposed to having to go, okay, I'm going to look at this file, I'm going to look at this file.
Makes sense. Yeah,
So
I guess I'll bring that back to my team and tell them how outdated they are for using make files and make all of that.
yeah, if you that just sounds wrong to me to run a make file for black.
Yeah, make files are really the domain of C and C++. That's where they came from. Not so you couldn't use them with other languages, but that's kind of where they live on. Is if you install some C code or C++ code from source, you'll see all these make files fly by, and that's because they're basically checking that the .o is newer than the .c and the .h. It's kind of a fairly simplistic dependency checking. And there's all these macros and stuff on top of that that are really obscure.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, it's especially I'd like to see that the community has really come around to poetry and this pyproject.toml file without there being as much controversy about migrating to tools. It's gotten to the point where, like I said on the previous one, I was still using setup tools and setup.py for a library management, and that it's gotten to the point where that talks of deprecating that are alive and will eventually be implemented. So it was about time to do something. But yes, for project management, especially if you're already familiar with something like npm from the node world, it has its benefits. It has some downsides to it, and playing around with other things. I will give you one example of that, which is if you're managing a library with poetry, and you test that library by running it in another file, like a dependency in another project, you're gonna have a really bad time doing that, because again, poetry exists inside of its own little world on a project, like all on a TOML by TOML basis. So that's really only been my one sore point dealing with it, but that really is more of a, I guess, a code sanitation, like a process sanitation that I need to work through, rather than being an inherent flaw with poetry itself. But with that, we can bring it to a close. If you want to learn more about poetry, it's a quick Google. We've been looking at the documentation here on screen. Everything is there. You look up a project that is using poetry if you want to see a lot of the nitty-gritty. There are a lot that use it, so just you'll probably within 3 guesses you'll find one. So thank you all for coming out. Stay safe in the hurricane, and we'll see you next month.